So last week we spoke about naming our shame. And this week we're going to continue the series with the I am statements of Jesus. This one being where Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And I think about that role as a shepherd, and I think of this role as being one that definitely and always will protect the sheep. And that there's many times where we have shepherds in society. We have what I call hired hands in society. And these hired hands, for example, may be like a fireman, a policeman, a nurse, a counselor, a doctor. In each of these roles, these hired hands are there to protect the sheep of society. They're there to protect you and I. But the reality is, and the reason why I really believe that Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, is because there are times when those hired hands don't actually protect the sheep. There are times when we look to those hired hands and they come back short or they come back void. I read the news and I read about some of these things that happen with the police, and it really hurts my heart. But I really understand that they're limited by the flesh. And Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And the reality is, we have to understand that he is the good shepherd and he protects his sheep. And I really believe that's why Jesus had to say that I am statement. Now, we also have to understand that fear is just a normal, natural emotion. And in fact, when Chelsea and I were getting ready to move out and start a church plant, she experienced real fear in her life. In fact, when I had that calling from the Lord and God really spoke to me, I went and I told her about it, and she began to weep because she was so paralyzed in fear about leaving the comfortable, leaving the security of a job, leaving the security of her home and her family to move out beyond what she knew into experiencing God's will in her life. She had real fear around that, and she had to walk through it. And it made me think that there are times when God is often calling each of us to move out beyond our fears to experience his fullness and his will. And fear is a real, natural, powerful emotion. In fact, there was a study done years ago with an infant and a white rat. And there was a gentleman by the name of Watson that was experimenting with this child, and he would allow a white rat to get close to the child, and then there would be a loud noise, Meh. And then when every time when that child would go to play with that rat, he would set that noise off, Meh. And then all of a sudden the child became deathly afraid and fearful of these white rats. And here's what is incredible is that not only did that child start to be completely afraid of white rats, that moved into other areas of the child's life. So, for example, like a white beard, like Santa's beard, the child was afraid of his beard, and the child would be afraid of other white objects. And I think about how many times in our lives where we have fear in a certain area of our life that then overtakes another area of our life. And the sad thing about fear is that when we operate in fear, we do not operate in the fullness of God's will. I think about when fear captivates a parent. When a fear takes hold of a parent, then they become super controlling, and their children never actually experience the fullness that God has for them. They become what I call helicopter parents. We actually have a running joke at my work. We call it failure to launch. It's kids in their mid 20s and in early 30s that their parents have covered them so much with protection and based on their fears that these kids never get to experience life to the fullest. In fact, they feel paralyzed to have a vision and a mission for their life. I think about when you have fear, not only in parenting, but how about your job? When you have fear in your job, you either don't take risk, the risk that your employer is trying to get you to take, or if you need to move out of that job to apply to a new job to either grow or get out of a bad situation, when you operate in fear, it's paralyzing. I also think about when we have fear of unknown, the unknown, and we have fear of change. And I think Chelsea's fears that she had, my wife, was really that fear of change, the change of moving. I know that me personally, I struggle with this fear of failure. Even having fear around opening my laptop, turning on this camera, and thinking about each person that's going to be watching me, each pastor that's going to be watching me, and actually filming this, and the fear of the critiques that could come back. But God has a plan that goes beyond operating fear for each of us. And Jesus knew that about our hearts, and that's why he said, I am the good shepherd, because he knows in order to operate out of our fear into his will, we have to realize that he is the good shepherd, and a good shepherd protects his sheep. In fact, the reason why he said that in John 10 is because he wanted to speak not only into my heart, but the hearts of everybody. So let's read John chapter 10. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep. And I think about that. And what Jesus is saying is he actually laid his life down for all those fears and all that anxiety and all that worry in your life. He hammered that sin and everything else to the cross. So we could experience and operate in the fullness of knowing who he is in our life, that he is the good shepherd and that he protects his sheep. Jesus goes on to say this. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. The wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. And I think about this, it's so easy to look to other people in our fears as protectors. It's easy to look to other people instead of looking to God when we feel unsafe. And it's okay to look to other people, but there is a limit to their abilities to really protect you and come around you. And ultimately, we have to understand that God is our ultimate protector. That no matter what role that they play in their life, they're going to be limited. That at some point they will perish. That eventually our parents do perish. And we have to understand that God is really the good shepherd in our life, and he protects his sheep. Jesus goes on to say, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Verse 15, even as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay my life down for my sheep. And really what Jesus is saying, he's making a promise of protection, but he also is saying, I know my sheep. He knows every fear that you're struggling with, especially right now in life. He knows all the fears of your hearts. He knows if you have a fear of money that's causing you to stockpile money up because you have this fear that you're never going to have enough. You have this fear that God won't provide that daily bread. He knows all your fears around being alone. He knows that fear of being alone. That you may have this real fear of being alone so you won't leave an unhealthy relationship. Or maybe it's opposite. You have a fear of staying in a healthy relationship because you're worried and fearful of the outcome of, again, losing another relationship. So you flee and you run, you fight or you flight. That's a normal instinct in our brains, to fight or flight. But God knows each of your hearts. He knows all the fears each of us struggle with. He knows the fears that we struggle with as pastors. He knows that fear of letting people down or not being able to get there to somebody's hospital when they're on to a hospital when somebody's on their deathbed. For me, I had this deep, also ingrained fear of doing my first funeral. I felt like, man, I just don't want to screw this up because I want to make sure I honor this person, their life, and I don't want to let that family down. But God will show up in those moments where you have those very real fears, even as a pastor, and he'll just take care of you. He'll take care of those fears. I also think about how we deal with those fears in our life personally. And when we operate in fear, then we're not operating God's fullness, and we need to handle those fears. And I think about how I handle fear in my life, and I think there's a few things that you can do to handle fear in your life. There's a few questions that you can ask yourself. And I think one of those questions, number one, is what am I afraid of? You actually have to look around at your behaviors where maybe you're trying to control an outcome, or you're superbly worried about something, and you really got to think, what am I afraid of that's driving that behavior? And then you have to go even deeper. You have to look what is triggering that fear. What infant part of yourself is triggering that fear? Maybe you failed greatly in the past before, and now you're gun shy. You have a fear of failing today in the present based on a failure way beyond the past. And then you got to look even deeper and understand what is the worst thing that can happen. You got to ask that question. And I think Jesus is saying the worst thing that can happen is that you spend eternity with him. And that is the worst thing, but it's actually the best thing. That you have to realize at the end of the day that no matter what happens, we get to spend eternity with Jesus, that he is the good shepherd, and that a good shepherd protects his sheep. When you walk in that security, you are now walking in the promise that God has for you that will allow you to operate in his purpose. But you got to ask yourselves those questions. You have to identify those fears in your life and you have to correct them. You have to identify and you have to correct. And when we start doing that as a church, when we start identifying our fears, even as a church that is isolating us from society, and we correct those fears and we operate in God's will, I believe that we will start reaching the nation that nobody else wants to reach. You're going to reach all the sick sheep that are out in the field wandering around, waiting to be protected by Jesus, by the good shepherd, waiting to experience that same security that each of you guys can experience and understand that a good shepherd protects his sheep. So you need to identify, you need to correct those fears in your life, and then you need to remember that a good shepherd protects his sheep, and Jesus is the good shepherd. Amen.